Well, this is him right here.
This is him right here.
No, this is
Am
him.
I okay? Am I coming out the speaker? I can't tell.
Should be streaming. Should be. All right.
Okay, so who's got their questions written down, ready to ask us questions today? Open mics Sunday. Because we've covered a lot of things in the last few months. We've covered abortion and some social issues around envy and the whole concept of the confusion that's caused by envy and the clarity that we can have as Christians. We have covered gratitude. And so we wanted to leave this time for you because I know we have an agenda and we try to move rather quickly through some of those. So we wanted this time to be for you to be able to ask any leftover questions that you may have, any things you've thought of since then that you might want to ask us about, etc. So, who's got a question for us to kick us off? Oh, and by the way, if you don't start asking questions, we will. And don't put it beyond us to call on you by name. Okay.
Check. All right. So I have two questions. The first is a matter of back to forgiveness. I was wondering, I was kind of thinking about like law and forgiveness and how those work and justice and different principles of that. And like the law isn't partial. If you break the law, you owe the penalty of the law. It doesn't matter whether you're rich, poor, whether you knew the law or whether you didn't know the law.
That's right.
In forgiveness, do you think there's partiality? Or should forgiveness also be impartial? If someone didn't know they offended me, I feel like I would like to be impartial and say you were ignorant. You shouldn't have done that to me. And
Isn't there, I'll ask you a question.
go for it.
Isn't there stipulations in the law that are not impartial? Like if you steal because you're hungry as opposed to if you're not hungry, or if you steal at night as opposed to in the day?
Yes, I would suppose so.
So there's also extenuating circumstances in the
circumstantial? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And so I would say that forgiveness is up to the forgiver.
Okay.
And we can forgive for any reason we want. I think some people forgive for the wrong reasons. For instance, there's people who forgive because they don't want to be bitter. To me, that's just completely the wrong reason to forgive, but it's their prerogative to do so. I can't tell you you can't forgive to not be bitter, even though I can tell you I don't think it works. I don't think it's legitimate. But at the end of the day, regardless of why you forgive somebody, the way I see forgiveness, it's a legal transaction, they're forgiven. Even if you're completely ignorant of what it is or what it means or what it accomplishes. And so I would say in a practical sense that nobody gets forgiven impartially. Doesn't happen.
Everything's partial.
What's that?
So everything would be partial in some
I think everything
extent.
is, just practically speaking. Now, I'm not saying it should be.
Yeah.
Right? And I would say that from a theoretical standpoint, Jesus told us if they say they're sorry, if they say, I've done you wrong, forgive me, we're supposed to forgive them full stop with no conditions. That's the end of that.
Yeah.
That's
Right.
right. And then they said, well, what if, 70 times 7, what if, or 7 times a day? And Jesus says, 70 times 7, I'm telling you, meaning no what ifs.
Yeah.
If they come to you and they say, I've sinned against you, I know it was wrong, forgive me, you're to forgive them. So I would say that in practice, it never works out that way exactly, because we're just human beings. And we're more likely to forgive our son than we are to forgive our neighbor. We're more likely to forgive our friend than we are our enemy. We're more likely to forgive without them even asking us if it's someone we love as opposed to someone we have a distaste for. So I think that's how it works out practically. I'm not advocating it or saying it's okay. I just think that's reality, right? So what's your other question?
The second question was a matter of justice, because I've seen some circumstances which possibly is just like you said, they don't understand, as you mentioned in your forgiveness sermons, that what real forgiveness is. And we talked a whole lot about how forgiveness is a specific transaction, a legal one, in a heavenly court where God will not hold guilty the person you forgive. It relinquishes whatever guilt that fill in the blank that is owed on their account. Is it unrighteous then, or incorrect, to so forgive somebody and still demand justice here on earth? For example, someone steals and you say, I forgive you, and you take them to court. Would this be contrary? Or, because I know like here on earth, there is a possibility they get taken to court anyways because that's the way the justice system works, and it's
Correct.
not partial to your forgiveness.
On a criminal offense.
On a
right?
criminal offense.
Correct.
And so in my head, it makes sense that if you forgive, you cannot take someone to the heavenly court. You've already relinquished that case. It's no longer can you take them to the earthly court, or would that still be against the meaningfulness of truly forgiving someone?
Right, that's a good question. Why don't you go ahead and take it?
All right, so, in all of these things around forgiveness, we have a challenge ahead of us, and that is that God is asking us to step up to a level of adulthood, if you will, in our Christian walk that goes beyond the simplicity of rules, right? We would all like to be guided by rules and principles in a way and say, we have these rules, as long as I stay within these rules, I feel like I'm good. But he's asking us to step up to a level of actually making judgments. And once we step up to the level where we're making a judgment, we step beyond just the level of rules, where we now have to consider all these externalities and internalities, and we have to make a judgment and live with the consequences of that judgment, whether that judgment is to forgive or whether that judgment is not to forgive. With certain exceptions, for instance, the one that Mike brought up a minute ago about where Jesus says, if they ask forgiveness, then you are to forgive them, right? He sets some boundary conditions, but leaves so much gray area, so much area for us to make judgments on in the middle of there. And then he gives us some principles about it, like if we don't forgive, then we have to be careful because we have no right to expect forgiveness from God then if we're not willing to forgive others. Now to the question of civil court, because that's what we're talking about, right? If we think of the criminal justice system the way we see it in most of the Western world, and I can't speak to everything in the Eastern world because I'm not familiar with all their justice systems, but as we see it in the Western world, our justice system is divided in two. One side is criminal justice, and the other side is civil justice. If someone offends me, let's say they steal something from me, and I, as a Christian, make the decision that I'm going to forgive them that, then what I have said is I give up my right to claim back from them what they stole from me. I'm not going to go after that, because in the end, the ultimate one who's offended in all of this isn't me, it's God. And by forgiving them, I have asked God himself not to hold them guilty for that, or to extract that back from them at the final judgment, in that particular case anyhow.
So
now, if I were to move forward and take it out into civil court and extract that back from them, I would be operating in opposition to the forgiveness that I had offered, that I had put, whether I had told them about it or not. If I had forgiven them that offense, and then I seek justice, my own civil justice for that offense, now I'm operating in two. I'm a double-minded man, if you will, and I'm on one side saying it's forgiven, on the other side I'm extracting justice. Now that's not the same as the criminal side. You understand? Those are two different things.
So I would see it differently, and so I'll give you how I see it, and then you guys can weigh it for yourselves. The way I look at it, and what I'm talking about forgiveness, is I'm talking about the biblical concept of it, and I believe that Christians can and should forgive people, and then that's bound in heaven, right? Which we've gone through. That
Right.
has no bearing on whether or not there are consequences for their actions. And so the easy one is a criminal, but it's only easy because it's taken out of our hands. You actually don't have temporal power to tell the judge, I want it to be forgiven. He goes, oh, well, then. For the most part, you don't, right? Now, you can refuse to show up and testify. There's a number of ways you can sabotage the trial, but it's not exactly legal to do so. Okay, so but that's taken out of our hands, so that's why it's easier. But I actually think that if we were to imagine that it weren't that way, and say, let's say you actually had the authority in all cases, civil, criminal, there was no distinction, right? And you could decide, and somebody were to kill your child, and you say, I forgive them, but should you then pursue the death penalty? I would say yes. Because I don't believe that forgiveness in heaven translates to no consequences on earth. Okay? And so that's how I look at it. And it's the same way with the civil issue. Let's say that somebody is driving drunk and or driving, let's not say drunk because that would be criminal, but let's say that somebody does something that's not criminal, but you result in being injured. Right? They say, look, I'm really sorry about that. And I know that I don't feel I did anything wrong, but I know you're damaged, and I'm sorry. And you say, you know what? I forgive you. Whatever guilt there may be, I forgive that. Okay, but you are now impaired for the rest of your life, and the only way you're going to be able to get any money coming in is if you take them to court or take their insurance to court and pursue that on a civil claim. Should you do that as a Christian? I would say yes. And they could say, well, but you forgave me. Yeah, but those don't cross lines. That's how I look at it. So if you want to redress that.
So I think there's caution to be had here, because think of the parable Jesus gives of the debtor. When there's a man who's forgiven a great debt by his master, and he goes out, finds someone else who owes him, and it's a legitimate debt that he is owed by someone else, and he demands payment for that debt. He's owed it, the payment should be made, and the payment is demanded, right? All of that is all right. But he had just been forgiven a far greater debt, and he should have forgiven that debt. And in forgiving it then, not be able to collect the debt. Have the debt be uncollected because the debt itself was forgiven. And I want you to understand that we're not actually saying two different things. We're drawing a line in two different sets of lines. One is whether or not we are going to hold someone guilty of an offense, and whether or not we hold someone guilty of a debt. And we have to be very careful of, because in the case of someone who steals something from me, it seems very clear. Because I'm not actually injured or out something most likely. Now, it could be if they stole my car, I'm out something really serious, something like that. But then we're talking about, and the next case is the one of someone who has injured me so that I'm unable to earn an income. And so we find two different cases. And this is the whole point of judgment. This is why it's so, this is not the easy thing that says, look, here's the rules that the Mikes and Mikes lay out, right? This is not this is the rule set that God gave us. Follow these rules, you're always right on forgiveness. The point is, it requires some judgment. There are times when you look at, for instance, raising a child, and you say, I'm not going to push that issue with the child right now. I'm not going to make them fix this thing or do this thing right now. But then there's a time when it comes when you say, you know what? You need to fix this. You need to fix it now. You need to take care of this. And you force them, so to speak, into doing the right thing. And they're both judgment calls, and it may be the same child, and it may even be the same kind of a thing, but the circumstances you judge differently, and you choose this thing in two different views, right? You operate that way, and that's the point that we're saying about this. This is not an easy, here's the rules. This is a complex matter of judgment.
So I would add to that and push back a little bit, and I think we're going to end up having a little bit of a discussion, which I think is great, very interesting. And if any of you want to pipe in and participate, that would be great also. So
We
if
would
you
like
have-
to hear.
Yeah, we would like to hear your view on this. So let's look at that. Let's consider, because that's a very good point that Mike makes on the parable of the two debtors. And I think it's good because we look at two different things with this. We look at the
Yes.
issue we're talking about, which is forgiveness, but we're also looking at how we interpret Scripture in general. And both of these things come into play. So this is how
Yes.
I look at that parable. I believe that what he's given us here is a very simple analogy. Okay? So
This is true.
in the category that he received forgiveness, he should have forgiven. That's to me the analogy. So Jesus paints a very simplistic picture. There is a man, there is a king or a lord. He has a servant. He forgives a servant a money debt. The servant goes out on the street, finds one of his co-servants that owes him a money debt, and chooses not to forgive the money debt. The question here in the interpretation side is he talking about people who owe you money? Or is he talking about forgiveness in general and that we owe others the type of forgiveness we've received? I look at it as the former. That it is an analogy, is not to be taken hyperliterally. It is an analogy, and what it's saying is that as we've been forgiven, we are to be forgiving. What's that? I'm sorry, correct, the latter. Thank you. So what does this mean? So I look at it then, now back to the forgiveness side of this issue. God has forgiven us. What does that mean on a day-to-day issue for us? When you were forgiven, were all consequences wiped off? Did you no longer, anything you'd done wrong, you're no longer going to go to jail for, you're no longer going to be sued for, you're no longer going to respond to, you don't have to answer for them? I don't think that's how it worked out.
Not even morally.
No, in any way.
In any way.
In any way. Not just because you can say the world is unfair or doesn't follow God's lines. I think that even if the world was exactly the kingdom, those consequences would still be there. And yet you're still
Indeed.
forgiven. And so forgiveness to me is something else. And so when I look at it to Joseph's question, and you say, if someone who has stolen from me says, will you forgive me? I can say, I forgive you, but you have to pay back the debt.
That's true.
Now, in the parable, what happened was he did not forgive. The second one said the same thing the first one said. Give me time, and I will pay you. And the Lord and the second one could have said, very well, I will give you time. And I think that would have been acceptable. Now, what the first one said was, don't worry about it. You no longer owe it to me, in a sense, because then he charged him for it, right? He kept it on the books in some way because he goes back and charges him for it. But anyways, the point here is, when we look at the analogy as an analogy, I think what it is that there is a level upon which we forgive, and that it is not held against them in judgment. It does not mean that they're always completely absolved temporally. So I think that, for instance, I think if, let's say your children are stealing money from you, and you catch them, and this almost always happens. In every family, there's a dirty little thief, right? And you're going to catch them as a parent. If you're smart, you'll catch them. What should you do? Should you forgive them? Yes. Should they pay it back? Absolutely, they should pay it back. Forgiveness, I don't think, should take away consequences, because I think it emboldens sin for the most part. Now, these are general principles.
They're very
it's
general.
Perfectly acceptable, and nothing wrong going to the parable. For you to tell someone who has wronged you, not only do I forgive you in heaven, let's say it this way, I forgive you on earth. You don't owe me anything. I don't want you to pay me back. It is
That's
completely, that is obviously your prerogative to do this.
That's right.
Does forgiveness in heaven, this is Joseph's basic question, does forgiving somebody, let's say in heaven, require you to relinquish all claim on earth? And my answer would be no.
I would agree. It's a very challenging judgment to make. If you have to err, on what side would be the side of safety? In every judgment, you're going to have to make that decision. And it's not going to necessarily be easy. In fact, the more you make these kind of judgments, the more you're going to have opportunity to make these kind of judgments. God will see to it because He's trying to mature you into being a king, right? That's going to be the end state. And then you're going to have to make these judgments more. And you'll find out there's a lot of places in your life where you have to make these kinds of judgments. And in every one of these cases, you have to figure out what's best for both you and the party that you're forgiving. And that's what makes this form, the biblical form of forgiveness, so much different than the worldly form of forgiveness. Because the biblical form of forgiveness takes not just account of you and your grudges or the condition of your heart or your mindset or whatever, right? It's not just you being eased of a burden. It takes into account the person being forgiven as well, and asks the question of what's in the best long-term interest of that person.
Yeah, that's the main point. True forgiveness, if you are operating under the true teaching and example, biblical example of forgiveness, then you are not thinking of yourself. Forgiveness just thinks of the other.
That's right.
And therefore, again, and you can see this, I think, is clear when we think about it if our children. The easiest thing to do with your children is just to say, okay, they're real sorry, they're crying, and you're like, okay, I'm going to forgive you. And the easiest thing to do is just let it be like that. But it's not always the best thing for the child.
Right.
Often what's best for the child is to have to go out and rake leaves every Saturday to make enough money to pay that back. And generally, you're not talking about any amount of money you actually care about maybe, right? But what you want them to know is that what you've done has serious consequences. And if you run this course, it's going to get worse and worse until you're going to end up in real big problems. That's what you're trying to teach them.
That's right.
And I think all of us have experienced cases, even if it's not with our kids, where the easiest thing to do for us would be to wipe the slate.
Right.
Right? That's what would be best for me to do. I don't want to deal with it. I mean, I do this, I think we all do this all the time. You go through a drive-thru and they don't give you, your apple pie you ordered. And instead of saying that, what they did is they looked in and saw that you don't need an apple pie. And so they were I'm sorry, Daniel. That was a low blow. No, and you're like, well, how important is this? And this is where people are like, well, it's the principle. And you'll get back in line in the drive-thru and like go all the way back through and be like, you owe me, whatever. And it's like, because the next time, and you're like, what is easy? It's easy to say, you know what? Just forget it. Just forget it. And I think we tend to have this attitude with people, and we need to realize I jest about things small like on the drive-through thing, but when you're talking about somebody that you're dealing with, and you're just like, I just don't want to go through the trouble. I just would rather suffer the loss, right? And that's certainly an acceptable. Even Paul says, right, in 1 Corinthians, that when there's a dispute among brothers, can't one of you just say, you know what, it's fine, I don't care. So what's that? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, sure. That's law. I'm not against that. But at the same time, you also, this is where what Mike is saying comes in. I agree with him. You have to exercise judgment. And you have to say, is that what's in the best interest of this other person?
That's right.
Right. If they're a serial offender, the best interest of this person is not for me to just let be another victim. And it's not because I'm too proudful, hypothetically, not me personally, but the hypothetical me is not too proudful to be insulted. That's not the point, right? The point is, am I encouraging them in behavior that will not only harm others, but is going to destroy them?
That's right.
And there comes a point where you have to say, no, we're not going to allow you to act this way. We are going to avail ourselves of whatever mechanisms there are for your good. And this is going to cost you. And it has nothing to do with you not being forgiven.
That's right. Or being a forgiving person. It has everything to do with you being a judge and exercising good judgment. And that's why oftentimes to forgive someone is actually the hardest path you can take. Because if you decide, I'm going to forgive this, now you have to decide what you're going to do about it next, whether they're going to still owe some consequence for it, and if so, how you're going to handle that. And if you do forgive it, your feelings of of offense don't automatically go away, and you're going to have to revisit this judgment while you deal with the other side of your heart, because the one side has said, I've forgiven it, and the other side now has to deal with this thing, right? It's not like you say, you know what, I'm just going to bear the wrong and let it be, and you just drive away. And that's fine if it's an apple pie. It's much harder if it's something else. And applying that principle means that you are doing a lot of thinking, sometimes even a lot of praying, to ask, Lord, what is in the best interest of that person? What should I do about this? And then even having made the judgment, you now have to, because no judgment is without consequences. And so you now have to deal with this in your own heart and mind. Yes, you had a question.
I have a comment. I agree wholeheartedly with everything that y'all said about the legal transaction aspect of forgiveness in heaven, and the correct thing to do on earth is to correct somebody's behavior. My comment is that the non-believer's gonna say, oh, there you Christians go again. Y'all forgive us in heaven, but you're hammering us here on earth. You're a hypocrite. And so that's the dilemma that we have. But so with all dilemmas that we have, even the thought of we want to change this person's actions, it also forces us to have a conversation with them to tell them the difference between forgiveness in heaven and them being responsible for their actions on earth. But
Right.
that is a complication of it, though.
Sure.
The non-believer is going to call us a hypocrite.
Sure, but I would say to that is, and this is applies generally on these issues. I don't let someone who doesn't understand math make me feel bad for doing math, right? They don't have a clue what forgiveness is. So, they can say that that's the way it is, and they'll make a lot of noise and waves about it. But in my conscience, I've actually thought this through, and I haven't done it from a perspective of self-gratification.
Right.
What's good for me. I've looked at it from a very objective point of view, with the heartfelt desire to do what's right by God according to His Word. So if I believe God was saying that I should do that, forgiveness was something else and was to be done in a different way, I'd be fine with that.
Right.
Right? But what you generally have is people who are going to benefit from this twisted view of forgiveness, who are trying to pawn it off or trying to sell it. And I'm not buying. And I don't feel bad for it. And I don't let them make me feel bad for it. But I think you are very right in what you say, to look at it as an opportunity then to teach. No, let me explain what forgiveness is. And look, I think we all have to be very careful. It is very easy to use self-righteousness as a cloak for maliciousness, right? To use the principle of the matter when really you're just angry and you want payback. And if that's the case, and this goes back to what Mike said, I think, that is where you need to say, even though that person needs to have a lesson taught to them, I'm not the person to do it.
Right.
Because I'm angry and I'm resentful and I'm vengeful and I am really looking out for myself. I'm really not looking out for them. I want my money back, and that's all I really care about. And I need to deal with my love of money more than their thievery, let's say, in that example.
Right. So the whole scenario of situations that require forgiveness, it also puts us in a position to evaluate ourselves and our motives for forgiving or not forgiving.
Correct.
And also for seeking the proper motive for there being a repercussion for sin here on earth. So I think that those are good things, and we should all take in consideration those opportunities when they arrive, what our motive is, and to pray and do as what
Yes, I think
God would have us.
I think the text here to examine, to understand what we're talking about and to get a good example of it is Paul to the Corinthians, right? In the first epistle, he writes them a blistering letter, and rebukes them very harshly. In the second letter, he then says, I didn't write that because I was trying to get even. I'm paraphrasing. But I didn't write that because I'm trying to get even. It was only for your good. And
That's right.
it hurt. It was the hardest thing, again paraphrasing, it was the hardest thing I've ever done, basically he's saying, to write you that letter. And I was very concerned, very worried that it wasn't going to work out the way I was hoping. And then I would feel really bad about it because I'm not sure that I know how to do what's right. I was just trying to do what's best for you. But because you have responded so well and you've corrected everything and you've fixed yourselves and you're prospering from it, I'm relieved. Because I realized then, okay, then I did do the right thing. But
Right.
Paul was very troubled. In fact, he said he needed somebody to be with him, but rather than have him there, he sent him to Corinth and says, I can't wait any longer. Go find out how they're doing. So he's having sleepless nights over whether or not he had handled it the right way. And when they came back and said, hey, they've fixed everything and everything is looking good, then he's relieved, right? So that's just taking those two epistles and reading them, just looking at how Paul is answering both the church and the man in 1 Corinthians 5. He also deals with that and how he did it and why he did that and how hard that decision actually was for him to make, and how happy he was when it worked out okay. I think we look at that, and that's the attitude we need to have for forgiveness. And if we aren't having that attitude, if it is not hard for us to press somebody to bring forth fruits meet for repentance, then we're not the ones that should be doing it. It's like a parent. I don't think any parent who finds glee or joy out of spanking should be spanking anybody.
Right.
Right? If you think that's fun and you're like, woo, I'm so happy, and you get inside, you're like, yes, oh, this makes me feel better, you shouldn't be laying a hand on anybody.
Right. And that's why I will go back and say this again because I think it warrants it. This is adult Christianity we're talking about. This isn't Sunday school, we all love each other and we all forgive each other form of Christianity. This form of forgiveness that we're talking about takes a lot of energy and time. And if you're thinking forgiving someone is going to unburden you, then you are missing the point entirely. In fact, if it isn't a bit of a burden to you, like it was to Paul to work through that issue with the Corinthians, and if it isn't that same burden on you to work through the issue with someone, to forgive them, and then figure out how to handle the next step in this thing, then you're not doing forgiveness the right way. That's not the kind of forgiveness. We're talking about the really hard cases. And those really hard cases, and you've got plenty of them, this thing can drag on for time. Think of how much time went between 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, and all that went in there. It was a whole year of time that passed between the first one and the second one when Paul is mulling that over in his mind and wondering what happened there in Corinth and how the church is doing it. I mean, they were a fledgling church in a wealthy city where they had lots of religious options. He could have destroyed that whole church with that one epistle, and he tells them, I had to make you sorry, because a godly sorrow leads to repentance, but I don't want to overdo it here. I don't want to, and if, just like parents with their children, how much discipline do you, if it's not going that way in your mind, then you're not doing forgiveness the way we're talking about. You're doing a Sunday school version of forgiveness where all you're really doing is you're just trying to relieve your own burden. You're not really trying to help the other person, because that one takes time and effort. Anything else? Are there any other subjects besides forgiveness? We can talk about this one for the entire time, but I want to make sure we get everybody's questions out about whatever it is that we've been talking about.
It doesn't have to be about anything we've talked about in Sunday
that's
school.
true.
If you have any questions, you're welcome to bring them out.
I think what we all really want to know is how many elections were stolen. How many votes also? In the millions? No, my question was if you could give distinguish the differences between judgment and discrimination. Whereas I think you answered it a little bit, where I find myself sometimes trying to make a judgment out of maybe a reservation of resentment, and they're blurred. Where I'm like, oh, well, I'm nitpicking because of discriminating, but then I'm like, I try to justify it by a righteous
So
judgment.
you mean discrimination in the common sense today, where we hold one person to a different standard based on their race or color or education level or
Relationship.
class?
Both a proper discrimination or discriminating.
Well, the
like,
reason I say is because discrimination and judgment are actually the same thing.
Right.
But nowadays, discrimination has taken on a different meaning, the word in our common popular culture. And it means to have a different standard for different people based on features or characteristics of the person.
Right.
So you're saying the difference between judgment and popular discrimination.
Yeah, you could hit that. Yeah.
Right.
Like the expound on that.
Right.
Whereas which one is which? Where I jokingly say, well, I discriminated against all other restaurants because I chose this one. Where it's like, well, does it work like, does discrimination?
Well, that's what I'm saying. Judgment and discrimination are the same thing, right?
Okay.
If you say we don't discriminate, well, then that means you don't make choices. Now, there is a popular sense of discrimination that we're actually using that word and applying it to something else, which I'm not against. I'm not criticizing that.
Right.
We only have X amount of words to use. And so words get reused and they become to mean or signify something entirely different than what they actually mean etymologically or historically, okay? So I just wanted to clarify that. Because you can't judge without discriminating.
Right.
It is the same thing, okay, as far as the word is concerned. The question is, and this is the real question, isn't about whether there's a difference between these words. The question is, what is the basis of judgment? Now, what we nowadays call discrimination is to base judgment upon unrelated characteristics. So we don't like somebody because of the color of their skin. Or we don't like somebody because of the amount of money they have in their bank account. Or we don't like somebody because of the family that they came from. This has no bearing whatsoever on the person themselves. We are not making a judgment of that person. We are making a judgment of something that person had no say in.
That's right.
Right? So what color their skin is, what family they were born in, what language they speak, these are things, this isn't that somebody decided these things. This is just who they are. And that is wrong. The Bible makes this wrong. This has nothing to do with civil rights. This has to do with the Bible. Right? And so this is just wrong. But judging a person based on their words and actions, their choices, is absolutely proper. And we just have to be very careful that what we're really judging people on is what they are responsible for, not what they're not responsible for. Whatever those things might be. I don't know if that answers what you're saying.
So in that case, we're not judging people on the things that they're responsible for. If there were
That they're not responsible for.
Excuse me. Yes, that they're not responsible for. So the color of the skin, where they were born, their nationality, everything where that they didn't have any choice of that. Would it be the popular sense of discrimination then, if you judged them on something they were responsible for, but they claim they didn't have responsibility for? Something I have on my mind is like their sexual orientation or different things. Like you are making a choice whether you're disposed to a certain thing or not. Because they'll claim they're discriminated against just as much as a black man was discriminated against, though the black man never chose to be black. He was born that way. So I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Correct.
Oh, that's a very good one.
That's a very good question.
And it falls on me to do the first part of the answer to that. So wouldn't that work out right? I can. So the answer is we must make judgments on people's choices, on the choices they make. Now, you have to understand. I think there's actually like 4 terms that we have to deal with. There's only a nuance in understanding between discrimination and judgment. Discrimination meaning to be able to tell the difference. Judgment meaning to now say whether some of those are good or bad. differences, right? So there's a nuance. They're essentially the same term, but there's a nuance of difference between them. Then when we think of what we think of as the popular term of judgment, which is actually what we would think of as condemnation, right? And so it's like we've got four terms we've kind of got to deal with, or four versions of terms we have to deal with there. And this one we're talking about. What do you do? Let's assume for a second. Let's see if we can find a way to put it in a weird illustration for ourselves, right? I was on board a plane one time, and I was sitting up in the front of the plane when there's this terrible commotion in the back of the plane. And I'm trying to ignore it and sleep, because that's what I do on planes, right? I sleep. But after a time, I notice that there's commotion now in the front of the plane. And what has happened is they have arrested a passenger and brought that passenger to the front of the plane. And this passenger is now seated a couple seats over from me. Let me tell you what they arrested that passenger for. They arrested that passenger for what he was eating. I have no idea what it was. All I know is that when he opened the container, the smell that came out of the container was so offensive to everyone in the back of the plane that some people actually vomited because of it. And the flight attendant asked him to put the lid on it and put it away for the remainder of the flight, and he refused to do so. And eventually the marshal got involved, and the man was arrested for disobeying one of the flight attendants and for offending so many people around him with the smell of what he was eating. Now, I give you that as a side illustration to take it out of homosexuality for a minute and say, here is somebody who's made a decision, and the decision they've made offends almost everyone around them. And somebody has to make a judgment. You can't not make a judgment. You cannot walk back and say, I don't smell anything. I see no difference between what he's eating and what somebody else is eating. The rest of you are all eating things, and those things may offend him, and therefore everybody should just put up with each other's food no matter how it smells. No, that wasn't exactly what happened. In fact, somebody had to say the majority of people here are offended by the smell of what you just opened there, and we have to do something about it because you're literally making some people around you ill. We have to put a lid on that, right? So a judgment had to be made, and in that judgment, there was a condemnation. And it wasn't of the man, it was of the food, and it was of the smell of the food. But the man so identified with his food that he refused to put a lid on it, and the result was he was now arrested and taken to the front. Now, I'm giving you that illustration because I want you to understand kind of the nuance of all those things. To walk back and say, I see no difference between the food would be ludicrous, right? Somebody says something smells better than something else. Some people are getting ill from this. To walk back, so that would be a lack of discrimination. To walk back and say, I notice that there's a difference, and then to say, so what? Don't let anybody care about that difference. It's bad of you people to get sick from this. It's terrible that you're offended by it, and everybody needs to settle down and just let things be as they are. That would be a lack of judgment. So you needed discrimination to tell that there was something there. You needed judgment to actually say, this thing is bad. And then, when that judgment was passed, put the lid back on the container, it could have ended there. But when the man refused to, you now needed condemnation to say, you're guilty of this thing. And I say that to say, when we're dealing with things like homosexuality, and there's probably 1,000 others, that one just seems to be very big in our society right now. When we're dealing with those things where there is clearly an element of choice, even if, let's just give them the argument that says, you had no choice in your orientation. Okay, but you have a lot of other choices that you're making. And now if you're 1/10 of the population and you offend the rest of the population, should the rest of the population simply shut up and not be offended by you if they find it offensive? And the answer is, that's a tough decision. That is a really tough judgment. You're saying now, we cannot notice a difference but you want to declare a difference. And this thing being obviously different, you don't want us, I'm just going through basic logic here. You don't want us to notice. And now having noticed, you don't want us to say or condemn about. So you want us to have no discrimination, no judgment, and no condemnation. This is the position you want us to be in. And I'm bringing that logic out because I wanted to show you how, from a purely logical perspective, it makes no sense. Now, that isn't a moral perspective. And the question Joseph asked was a moral question, which is, should we, right? Whenever you're asking shoulds or oughts, they're moral questions. Should we do something about, should we pass a judgment? Should we notice the difference and pass the judgment? And the answer is, there's no way we can escape it. There's no way we as Christians can escape that. Now, that doesn't deal with how we treat those people. That's the moral judgment. Now the question is, how do we treat people who are homosexual? And that passes into a very nuanced area for us. Because it's going to depend on how confrontational they want to be or how in your face they want to be. But that would be true of anything, right? If somebody wants to be a drunk and they want to be confrontational and in your face about it, or they want to promote drugs and they want to be confrontational and in your face about it, you have to deal with that. But as long as they're not that way, you can treat them on a whole scale of different ways. Personally, I recommend that you pick the highest road you can in every case. The highest moral road you can possibly take, which means considering both them and those around them. And that has nothing to do with your own comfort or success in this world. And you're going to find that's true of many moral stands. There are those who would in however they want to put it, doesn't matter, they would condemn all white people in America for being white right now. Whatever other words they want to use for it, the ultimate result of it would be a condemnation of them. How are you going to deal with that? And you're going to deal with it exactly the same way. You have to pick the highest moral stand for both you and them and those around them. And that's not an easy judgment in all cases. I'll hand it over.
So, I don't know if Joseph's still here, but anyways. Oh, okay. So the way I understood Joseph's question is that there are characteristics that we say we don't discriminate by because people have no choice in them. And then we can take other things like, let's say, homosexuality, same-sex attraction, or let's say pedophilia, or let's say polygamy, right? There's a whole lot of things we could put in there and say, people can say and claim they have no choice in them. So do we treat these things the same way as we would skin color, ethnic background? Okay. They're not the same thing, first off.
That's right.
Okay? They're not the same thing. There's no way to act upon ethnic background. There's no way in which you act upon skin color. There's just, it is. There's no action involved in this. So what they're talking about is, one is they say they would make a claim that they have no choice in their sexual preference. I don't know that. I'm willing to stipulate that that's true for a lot of reasons we don't have time to go to. So let's just say that's absolutely true. You don't actually make the choice of your sexual orientation. You don't make the choice of whether or not you prefer monogamy or polygamy. You don't make the choice of what age of a sexual partner you prefer. Okay, fine. Let's say you don't make that choice. It doesn't make any difference. How you act upon that choice is what society judges.
That's right.
It's what we as Christians, now that's not what God judges. We got to be very careful here. Now we're getting into the issue of sin. God judges sin, and He can call some things that you have no choice in sin.
That's right.
Now, that may be very hard for even Christians to accept, but it's simply true, and that's something where we probably ought to talk about some other day. But God can call things you had no choice in sin.
Absolutely.
Okay? But that's not what we judge. So we're talking about us and how we deal with people. I do not judge people based on things they have no choice in, but only upon how they act upon those things. That's what I am called upon to make judgment on. Okay? And so This person has no choice in the matter. They don't act upon it. I make no judgment based on that. Now, when we look at it from something that you find repulsive, let's say pedophilia, that may be hard for you to accept. Okay, but what about adultery?
That's right.
I'm not talking about committing adultery. I'm just talking about wishing you could.
Right.
In your mind, wishing you were with someone else.
The thought of.
Yes. The desire for. Or any other desire we could fill into there. Well, you should be pretty happy that we're not judging then on thoughts, but on actions. Now God does, and that's a separate matter. But that's how I would point us to. So when they say, well, you're judging me on something I had no choice in, no, that's not true. That's not true. It's about what you do with those desires. Same way I would with any man who is polygamous. I'm not judging him because he might have had a desire for something, but he's gone out and committed adultery. It is the action that we're judging. I don't know if that answers your question. Well, we're out of time. So, thank you for participating.